The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Camilla Parker Bowles stood before the ornate mirror in her private chambers. Her reflection showed a woman who had climbed the highest social ladder in Britain, yet today felt the weight of every step she had taken. The diamond tiara that once symbolized her acceptance into the royal family now felt heavy upon her brow, like a crown of thorns. Outside her window, she could hear the distant murmur of crowds gathering in the streets. What had started as whispered conversations in London's coffee shops had grown into something far more dangerous. Social media buzzed with hashtags calling for her removal, and prominent figures who had once bowed in her presence now openly questioned her right to wear the crown. The scandal had erupted 3 weeks earlier when investigative journalists uncovered a series of private recordings from decades past. In these conversations, Camilla had made disparaging remarks about common citizens, referring to them as the unwashed masses and expressing her belief that royalty existed to rule over, not serve, the people. The recordings painted a picture of a woman who viewed her position not as a duty to the nation, but as a privilege that elevated her above ordinary citizens. Lady Margaret Thornfield, Camilla's longtime friend and confidant, had been the first to warn her of the brewing storm. Margaret had burst into Camilla's morning tea, her face pale with worry, clutching a tablet displaying the trending news stories. The headlines were merciless: Queen Consort's true feelings revealed and audio tapes expose. Royal contempt for public. As Camilla read through the articles, she watched her carefully constructed public image crumble. For years, she had worked to transform herself from the other woman in Charles and Diana's marriage into a respected member of the royal family. She had attended charity events, smiled graciously at state dinners, and learned to navigate the complex web of royal protocol. Yet these recordings threatened to undo everything she had built. The palace's crisis management team, led by Sir James Whitmore, had attempted damage control. They released statements claiming the recordings were taken out of context, that Camilla's words had been twisted by those seeking to damage the monarchy. However, the public's reaction was swift and unforgiving. Protests began forming outside royal residences, with citizens carrying signs reading "Not our Queen" and "Respect the People." Social media amplified the outrage. Videos of Camilla's past public appearances were re-examined through this new lens, with people pointing out moments of perceived coldness or disconnect. Influential bloggers and YouTube personalities analyzed her body language, suggesting they could see signs of her true feelings toward the public. The narrative had shifted from viewing her as a reformed figure to seeing her as someone who had simply learned to hide her disdain. Members of Parliament began receiving unprecedented numbers of calls from constituents demanding action. Several prominent MPs, including those from Charles's own political allies, released statements expressing their deep concern about the revelations. The Prime Minister, caught between respecting the constitutional monarchy and responding to public pressure, called for serious reflection on the matter. Religious leaders, who had previously welcomed Camilla's involvement in charitable causes, now questioned whether someone with such attitudes could truly serve as a moral figurehead. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had played a role in legitimizing her marriage to Charles, found himself in an impossible position as congregations across the country demanded answers. The royal family's traditional response of remaining silent and waiting for controversies to pass was proving inadequate in the face of this digital age scandal. Unlike previous royal controversies that had been confined to tabloid newspapers and television coverage, this story spread across every platform simultaneously. Young people who had never shown interest in royal affairs found themselves passionately engaged in debates about privilege, respect, and democratic values. International media picked up the story, with foreign correspondents painting it as a symbol of Britain's struggle with its past and its future. American news networks ran features on the last days of royal privilege, while European papers questioned whether this marked the beginning of the end for the British monarchy as an institution. Behind closed doors at the palace, emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Senior advisors presented polling data showing Camilla's approval ratings in free fall. Constitutional experts debated the unprecedented nature of the situation. Never before had a queen consort faced such widespread calls for removal from office. Charles found himself torn between his love for his wife and his duty to the crown. Palace insiders, speaking anonymously to journalists, revealed that the king was struggling with sleepless nights as he weighed his options. Some sources suggested heated arguments behind closed doors, while others painted a picture of a man paralyzed by an impossible choice. The recordings had not only damaged Camilla's reputation, but it also raised questions about Charles's judgment in marrying her despite these views. Critics argued that if he had known about her true feelings toward his future subjects, his decision to make her queen consort showed a disconnect from the people he was meant to serve, as the sun set on that fateful morning when Camilla stood before her mirror. The crowds outside had grown larger and more vocal. Their chants echoed through the palace walls, a constant reminder that the institution she had fought so hard to join was now turning against her. The woman who had once been seen as the monarchy's path to modernization had become its greatest liability. And everyone inside those ancient walls knew that something would have to give. The crisis deepened as dawn broke over London on the fourth day of what newspapers had dubbed the Palace Rebellion. Camilla awoke to find her personal staff unusually scarce, with several longtime employees having quietly submitted their resignations overnight. Sarah Mitchell, her private secretary, who had served her faithfully for 8 years, left only a brief note expressing her inability to continue in good conscience. The morning newspapers painted an even grimmer picture than before. The Times ran a devastating editorial titled, "When Queens Forget Their Subjects," while The Guardian published leaked internal palace communications showing advisors discussing potential exit strategies. Most damaging of all, the Daily Mail had obtained additional audio recordings, these featuring Camilla dismissing wounded veterans as broken toys. During a private dinner conversation, Parliament convened an emergency session that morning, something that hadn't happened for a royal crisis since the abdication of Edward VIII. The chamber buzzed with tension as MPs from all parties prepared to address what many were calling a constitutional crisis. The leader of the opposition stood before a packed house, declaring that the British people deserve better than a queen consort who views them with contempt. Outside Westminster, protesters had established a permanent presence. University students camped alongside elderly pensioners, all united in their demand for Camilla's removal. Sarah Thompson, a single mother from Manchester, had become an unexpected spokesperson for the movement. Her viral video, posted from the protest site, eloquently captured the public's feelings. "We don't ask for much from our royals, just basic respect. How can someone who thinks so little of us represent us to the world?" The international implications began to manifest as Commonwealth nations started distancing themselves from Camilla. The Canadian Prime Minister issued a statement expressing serious concerns about the revelations, while Australian Republicans seized the moment to renew their calls for independence from the monarchy. New Zealand's parliament passed a motion condemning the comments, creating diplomatic headaches for the Foreign Office. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere had become suffocating. Camilla found herself increasingly isolated as even her closest allies began to reconsider their positions. Lady Margaret Thornfield, her oldest friend, arrived for what would be their final private conversation. Margaret's words cut deep. "Darling, I've stood by you through everything but this. This is different. The recordings show a side of you that even I find difficult to defend." Charles struggled with the impossible position of supporting his wife while preserving the crown's integrity. Royal biographer James Whitman later revealed that the king had suffered what palace doctors described as exhaustion-related symptoms, requiring private medical attention. The stress was evident in his public appearances, where the usually composed monarch appeared, haggard and distracted. The Archbishop of Canterbury requested an urgent private audience with Charles, a meeting that lasted 3 hours behind closed doors. Religious sources later suggested that the Archbishop had presented the king the moral framework for understanding his dilemma, emphasizing the crown's responsibility to embody the values it claimed to represent. Corporate sponsors began withdrawing support from royal-affiliated charities associated with Camilla, The Queen Consort's literary trust lost 3 major donors in a single day, while her patronage of various cultural institutions became a liability rather than an asset. Museums and theaters found themselves caught between honoring royal patronage and responding to public pressure, the royal protection. Officers assigned to Camilla faced an increasingly difficult task as crowds grew larger and more vocal. While maintaining their professional duty, several officers privately expressed concerns about the sustainability of current security arrangements. The Metropolitan Police Commissioner met with palace officials to discuss enhanced security measures. Acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the public hostility, television ratings soared as news. Programs dedicated extensive coverage to the unfolding drama. Royal correspondents who had spent careers analyzing the subtleties of palace politics found themselves reporting on something entirely unprecedented. Nicholas Witchell, the BBC's royal correspondent for decades, admitted on air that he had never witnessed anything quite like this level of public rejection of a senior royal. Social media continued to amplify the crisis, with new revelations emerging daily from members of the public who had encountered Camilla at various events over the years. A former charity worker shared her experience of Camilla's dismissive attitude toward homeless individuals during a shelter visit. A military veteran posted about feeling humiliated after Camilla questioned whether his injuries were really that serious during a medal ceremony. The Prince and Princess of Wales found themselves in an awkward position, having to balance family loyalty with their own public image. William and Catherine had worked hard to modernize the monarchy's relationship with the public, and Camilla's scandal threatened to undermine their efforts. Palace sources suggested that William had privately urged his father to consider all options for resolving the crisis. Behind the scenes, constitutional experts debated precedents and possibilities. Professor Eleanor Hartwell of Oxford University published a widely read analysis of the legal mechanisms that could potentially address the situation. Her work explored historical precedents for royal family members stepping back from duties, though she noted that nothing quite matched the current circumstances. The Queen Consort's diary began to empty as organizations quietly withdrew invitations or postponed events. A prestigious literary festival canceled her scheduled appearance as the guest of honor. Citing unforeseen circumstances, the Royal Opera House postponed a gala evening that was to have featured Camilla as the primary patron. With organizers privately admitting they feared disruption from protesters, as evening approached, crowds outside Buckingham Palace had swelled to unprecedented numbers. Police estimated over 50,000 people had gathered, their chants echoing through the heart of London. The scene was peaceful but determined, with protesters holding candles and singing patriotic songs while demanding change. The juxtaposition of loyalty to Britain, alongside rejection of its Queen Consort, created a powerful visual that dominated news coverage worldwide. Inside the palace, Camilla sat alone in her private sitting room, surrounded by the portraits of monarchs past. For the first time since the crisis began, she allowed herself to contemplate what had once been unthinkable, that her time as Queen Consort might be coming to an end. The weight of that realization settled upon her as the distant sound of thousands of voices calling for her departure provided a haunting soundtrack to her solitude. The 7th day brought news that would prove to be the final nail in Camilla's royal coffin. A former palace chef named Roberto Martinelli came forward with recordings he had made on his personal device during a private dinner party at Highgrove House 2 years earlier. The audio captured Camilla making inflammatory comments about immigrant communities, referring to new British citizens as pretend patriots who could never truly understand British values. The revelation sent shockwaves through the multicultural communities that formed the backbone of modern Britain. Leaders from various ethnic and religious groups, who had previously maintained respectful relationships with the royal family, issued statements of condemnation. The Muslim Council of Britain called for immediate action, while Hindu and Sikh organizations expressed their deep disappointment in someone they had once welcomed into their places of worship, Dr. Amina Hassan, a respected community leader and recent recipient of an MBE for her work with refugee families, spoke tearfully on national television. "I stood in that same room with her just months ago, accepting what I thought was genuine appreciation for my community's contributions to Britain. To know she was thinking such thoughts while smiling at me? It's heartbreaking. The recording's impact extended far beyond community leaders. Regular citizens who had celebrated their British citizenship ceremonies, who had worked for decades to integrate into British society, felt personally attacked. Social media filled with stories from people sharing their experiences of becoming British, their pride in their adopted country, and their shock at discovering how the Queen Consort truly viewed them. Charles's position became untenable as members of his own government began openly calling for action. The Home Secretary, whose department worked closely with immigrant communities, issued a statement that stopped just short of directly criticizing the Queen Consort, but made clear that such views were incompatible with modern British values. Crisis reached the international stage when the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights expressed concern about the recordings, particularly their potential impact on community relations within the UK. Foreign ambassadors from Commonwealth nations requested meetings with the Foreign Office, seeking clarification on Britain's official position regarding the comments. Inside the palace, emergency meetings now included constitutional lawyers flown in from across the Commonwealth. They worked through the night, examining every possible legal and procedural avenue for addressing the unprecedented situation. The phrase constitutional crisis appeared in official memoranda for the first time, acknowledging that the monarchy faced its greatest challenge since the abdication. Crisis of 1936. Camilla's isolation became complete when even her own family began to distance themselves. Her son, Tom Parker Bowles, who had built his own public profile as a food writer and television personality, released a statement through his publicist expressing his personal disappointment in his mother's comments. The statement was brief but devastating in its implications. The financial markets began to reflect the uncertainty. With tourism stocks falling as international visitors canceled trips to Britain, the royal brand that had been worth billions to the British economy was suffering measurable damage. Business leaders privately urged government officials to find a swift resolution to prevent further economic impact. Archbishop Justin Welby made an unprecedented public statement after Sunday service at Canterbury Cathedral, addressing the crisis for the first time publicly, while carefully avoiding direct criticism of any individual. He spoke passionately about the Christian duty to welcome strangers and treat all people with dignity and respect. His words were widely interpreted as a rebuke of Camilla's recorded comments. The BBC faced its own dilemma as public pressure mounted for them to stop referring to Camilla by her royal title in news reports. A heated debate erupted within the corporation about journalistic neutrality versus public sentiment. Eventually, they compromised by using her title less frequently and including more context about the ongoing controversy in their reporting. University students across the country organized coordinated protests, with simultaneous demonstrations at Oxford, Cambridge, Edinburgh, and other major institutions. Young people who had grown up expecting their royals to embody modern inclusive values felt particularly betrayed. Student union presidents issued a joint statement calling for educational institutions to reconsider any honorary degrees or positions previously offered to Camilla. The Labour Party seized the moment to call for broader reforms to the monarchy, with party leader Sir Keir Starmer suggesting that the crisis demonstrated the need for elected officials to have greater oversight over royal appointments. While stopping short of calling for abolition of the monarchy, his comments opened a new front in the political battle surrounding the crisis. International media coverage intensified, with CNN and other major networks sending additional correspondents to London. The story was framed as a test of modern democracy's ability to hold traditional institutions accountable. French television in particular drew parallels to their own historical struggles with monarchy, while German media questioned whether Britain was ready to confront its past and embrace genuine equality. Palace staff began implementing what insiders called transition protocols, quietly preparing for various scenarios including Camilla's potential departure from public life. Senior courtiers who had served multiple monarchs confided privately that they had never experienced such sustained and widespread public rejection of a senior royal family member, the Metropolitan Police Commander responsible for royal protection held urgent consultations with government security advisors. While the protests remained peaceful, the scale and intensity of public feeling created unprecedented security challenges. Additional resources were deployed around all royal residences, not just to protect the family, but to maintain order among the growing crowds. As night fell over London, the crowds outside Buckingham Palace had grown to their largest size yet. Police estimated over 100,000 people had gathered throughout the day, creating what observers described as the largest royal-related demonstration in British history. The mood remained determined but peaceful, with organizers working to maintain discipline, while protesters from all walks of life united in their demand for change. Inside her private chambers, Camilla made a decision that would change everything. She requested paper and pen from her remaining personal assistant and began to write what many would later recognize as one of the most consequential letters in modern royal history. Her hand trembled slightly as she formed the words that would mark the beginning of the end of her time as queen consort. The letter Camilla wrote that night would never be sent, but its contents revealed the depth of her internal struggle. She wrote to Charles, pouring out her fears, regrets, and growing realization that her presence was damaging the institution he loved more than anything else. She admitted that she had underestimated how deeply her old attitudes would wound people who had welcomed her into their hearts and their nation. The morning of the 8th day brought devastating news from an unexpected source. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, requested a private audience with Charles. Known for her blunt speaking and unwavering dedication to duty, Anne's words carried particular weight within the family. Palace sources later revealed that she told her brother directly, "The crown cannot survive this. You must choose between your wife and your duty to the realm." Anne's intervention marked a turning point because she had been one of Camilla's few consistent supporters within the royal family. Her military background and practical nature had led her to appreciate Camilla's straightforward approach to royal duties. If Anne had reached her breaking point, it signaled that even Camilla's allies recognized the situation was irreparable. The conversation between the siblings lasted for hours, during which Anne presented Charles with polling data she had commissioned independently. The numbers were stark. 78% of Britons wanted Camilla to step down from her royal duties, while 62% said her continued presence made them less likely to support the monarchy overall. Most damaging of all, 45% of people under 35 said the crisis had permanently damaged their view of the royal family. Meanwhile, Camilla faced her own moment of truth when her longtime friend Lady Margaret Thornfield arrived at the palace carrying a folder of photographs. These images, taken by guests at various private gatherings over the years, showed Camilla's facial expressions during interactions with minority guests, disabled individuals, and working-class people receiving honors. While the photos didn't prove anything definitively, they painted a visual narrative that supported the audio recording's portrayal of her. Attitudes. Margaret spread the photographs across Camilla's desk with tears in her eyes. "Darling, these are going to surface eventually. People are looking at everything now, analyzing every moment, every expression. You know I love you, but I cannot defend this anymore." Visual evidence was damning because it showed patterns of behavior that aligned with the recorded comments. The government faced mounting pressure as Commonwealth leaders began expressing concerns about upcoming royal visits. The Prime Minister of Canada privately communicated that Camilla would not be welcome on the planned state visit scheduled for the following month. Australia's Governor-General suggested that any future visits would need to be reconsidered if the current situation remained unresolved. Charles found himself increasingly isolated within his own palace as senior advisors began presenting him with options he had refused to consider just days earlier. Sir James Whitmore, his most trusted aide, prepared a briefing document outlining 3 potential scenarios: complete denial and hoping for public opinion to shift, a temporary withdrawal of Camilla from public duties, or a permanent separation of Camilla from royal responsibilities. The third option included detailed plans. for how such an unprecedented action might be implemented while preserving as much dignity as possible for all involved. Constitutional experts had identified several historical precedents where royal family members had quietly withdrawn from public life, though nothing exactly matched the current circumstances. Religious leaders across Britain united in calling for resolution. Though they carefully avoided directly demanding specific actions, the Archbishop of Canterbury met with leaders from other faiths, and together they issued a statement emphasizing the importance of forgiveness, accountability, and the healing power of acknowledging mistakes. Their words were widely interpreted as providing a moral framework for Camilla to step aside gracefully. The crisis took an unexpected turn when former Prime Minister Tony Blair, speaking at a private gathering that was recorded by attendees, suggested that the monarchy needed to demonstrate it could adapt to changing social values or risk becoming irrelevant. His comments, though made in a private setting, were leaked to the media and added political weight to the growing calls for action. International coverage reached a crescendo when CNN anchor Christiane Amanpour devoted an entire program to the crisis, featuring interviews with constitutional experts, community leaders, and royal biographers. The program, watched by millions globally, presented the situation as a test case for whether traditional institutions could maintain legitimacy in an increasingly diverse and democratic world. Corporate Britain began to take sides as major companies quietly reviewed their royal patronages and associations. Several firms that had sponsored events featuring Camilla announced they would be reassessing their partnerships going forward. The economic pressure added another dimension to the crisis. That palace officials could not ignore. The breaking point came when Charles received a confidential briefing from the intelligence services outlining potential security concerns if the situation continued to deteriorate. While protests had remained peaceful, security officials warned that sustained civil unrest could create opportunities for extremist groups to exploit the divisions within British society. That evening, Charles made the most difficult decision of his reign. He summoned his private secretary and dictated instructions for arranging what would become known as the final family meeting. Palace historians would later note that no monarch since Henry VIII had faced such a fundamental choice between personal relationships and constitutional duty. Camilla spent her last night as queen consort in her private sitting room, surrounded by the mementos of her royal journey. She held each item, remembering the hope she had felt when first joining the family, the work she had done to earn public acceptance, and the charitable causes she had genuinely supported. The realization that it was all ending filled her with a complex mixture of sadness, relief, and regret. As dawn approached, she wrote a second letter, this one to the British people. Unlike the previous night's emotional outpouring to Charles, this letter was carefully crafted to explain her decision and express genuine remorse for the pain her comments had caused. She wrote about her journey of understanding, her recognition that her past attitudes were wrong, and her acceptance that stepping aside was necessary for the good of the institution she had come to love. The letter concluded with words that would be remembered long after the crisis passed. A queen consort's duty is to serve the people alongside her king. I have failed in that duty, not through my actions as your queen consort, but through attitudes I held that were unworthy of the role and harmful to the people I was meant to serve. I cannot change my past words, but I can ensure they do not continue to damage the crown that belongs to all of you. Sighed. The crowds maintained their vigil, unaware that inside those ancient walls, history was being written and a decision was being made that would change the monarchy forever. The morning of the 9th day arrived with unprecedented secrecy within Buckingham Palace. Senior staff had been instructed to report for essential duties only, while most courtiers found themselves barred from the inner corridors where history was about to be made. The king had spent the night in consultation with his most trusted advisors, finalizing arrangements that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. At precisely 9 o'clock, Sir James Whitmore emerged from the king's private study carrying a sealed envelope that would change everything. The envelope contained 2 documents: Camilla's formal letter of withdrawal from royal duties and Charles's official acceptance of her decision. Constitutional experts later noted that the Language was carefully crafted to avoid setting precedents that might weaken the monarchy while still acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the situation. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived at the palace through a private entrance, his presence signaling that this was not merely a political or constitutional matter, but one that touched the moral foundation of the institution. He would later describe the morning as one of the most solemn in his tenure. Combining elements of personal tragedy with institutional necessity, Camilla dressed carefully for what everyone understood would be her final official appearance as queen consort. She chose a simple navy dress, removing all but the most basic jewelry, understanding that this moment required dignity rather than grandeur. Her lady's maid, one of the few staff members who had remained loyal throughout the crisis, helped her prepare while both women fought back tears. The media had been alerted that a significant announcement would be made at noon, but speculation ran wild about its exact nature. Royal correspondents positioned themselves outside the palace gates while newsrooms across the world cleared their schedules for what many suspected would be a historic moment. The betting odds on various outcomes fluctuated wildly as rumors spread through in London's political and media circles. Inside the palace's blue drawing room, final preparations were being made for what would become known as the abdication speech. Though technically Camilla was withdrawing from duties rather than abdicating a throne she had never officially held, the room was chosen for its intimacy rather than grandeur, reflecting the personal nature of the decision while maintaining appropriate royal dignity. Charles spent the final hour before the announcement walking alone in the palace gardens, a ritual he had followed before every major decision of his reign. Palace staff observed from a respectful distance as their king grappled with emotions that no constitutional document could adequately address. He was losing his wife as a partner in royal duties, possibly forever, yet doing what he believed was necessary to preserve the crown for future generations. The crowds outside had grown throughout the morning as word spread that something significant was about to happen. Police estimated that over 200,000 people had gathered in central London, creating the largest spontaneous gathering in recent British history. The mood was tense but hopeful, with many protesters sensing that their persistent demands were finally being heard. Television networks interrupted regular programming as palace officials confirmed that both the king and queen consort would address the nation together. This detail sent shockwaves through the assembled media. Joint statements during constitutional crises were extraordinarily rare. Royal historians scrambled to find historical precedents, while commentators speculated about what such an arrangement might mean. At exactly 11:05, Camilla made her way to the blue drawing room for the last time as queen consort. She paused at the portrait of Queen Elizabeth II that hung in the corridor, offering what observers described as a small nod of acknowledgement to the woman who had eventually accepted her into the family. Palace staff who witnessed this moment later said it captured both Camilla's respect for the institution and her understanding that her time within it was ending. Charles joined her in the drawing room at precisely 11, and for 5 minutes they sat together in silence, holding hands while camera crews made final adjustments. These would be their last moments as king and queen consort, and both understood the historical significance of what they were about to do. No words were exchanged. Palace observers noted the evident emotion both displayed during this private interlude. The broadcast began at exactly noon with Charles speaking first, his voice steady but clearly emotional as he addressed the nation about the crisis that had engulfed his reign's early months. He spoke about the monarchy's duty to reflect the values of the people it served and acknowledged that recent revelations had created an impossible situation that required unprecedented action the crown has endured for centuries, because it has shown the capacity to change when change was necessary, Charles said, his words carefully chosen to balance institutional continuity with the current crisis. Today, we face such a moment, and we must act with the same courage that our predecessors showed during their greatest challenges. Camilla then spoke, her voice clear but trembling slightly as she addressed the nation directly. She offered what many considered a genuine apology for the views expressed in the recordings, acknowledging that her words had caused real pain to communities across Britain and throughout the Commonwealth. Her statement was carefully crafted to accept responsibility without making excuses or attempting to contextualize her past comments. Came to this role hoping to serve alongside my husband in supporting the institutions and values that make Britain great, she said, looking directly into the camera. I have realized that my past words and attitudes make it impossible for me to fulfill that role effectively. The office of Queen Consort belongs to the people, and if the people cannot trust the person holding it, then that person must step aside. The announcement that she would immediately withdraw from all royal duties and relinquish her titles sent shockwaves through the assembled crowds outside. The initial reaction was one of stunned silence, followed by what started as scattered applause that gradually grew into the thunderous ovation that would be remembered as the sound of constitutional history being made. Charles concluded the broadcast by announcing that Camilla would retain her private title as his wife but would no longer participate in royal ceremonies, state functions, or public duties. The statement was unprecedented in modern royal history, effectively creating a new category of royal family member who remained part of the family personally while being excluded from its public functions. As the cameras stopped rolling, Camilla removed the simple pearl necklace that had been her signature piece during royal engagements, handing it to Charles in a gesture that symbolized her transition from public figure to private citizen. Palace staff who witnessed this moment later described it as both heartbreaking and dignified, capturing the personal cost of constitutional duty. The immediate aftermath of the announcement created scenes that would be etched into British history forever. As news of Camilla's withdrawal spread through the crowds outside Buckingham Palace, the initial stunned silence gave way to an emotional release that had been building for over a week. The applause that began as scattered clapping from various corners of the crowd gradually unified into a thunderous ovation that could be heard for miles across central London. Sarah Thompson, the single mother from Manchester who had become an unofficial spokesperson for the protesters, found herself crying as she joined the applause. It's not that we wanted to hurt anyone, she would later tell reporters, but we needed to know that our voices mattered, that even the most powerful people in our country would listen when we spoke up for what was right. Inside the palace, Camilla experienced the sound of the crowd's approval as a complex mixture of vindication and loss. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the sea of people who had gathered to demand her removal and were now celebrating her decision to step aside. The irony was not lost on her that this moment of public triumph was also her moment of personal defeat. The international reaction was swift and unprecedented. Prime ministers from across the Commonwealth issued statements praising both Camilla's decision and Charles's leadership during the crisis. President Biden released a statement from the White House, commending the peaceful resolution of a difficult constitutional matter and expressing confidence in the strength of British democratic institutions. Television news networks immediately shifted into historical analysis mode, with royal experts and constitutional scholars attempting to place the day's events into proper historical context. Professor Eleanor Hartwell, who had become a prominent voice during the crisis, told the BBC that what we've witnessed today is the modern monarchy, demonstrating that it can still evolve when evolution is necessary for survival. Logistics of Camilla's transition from queen consort to private citizen had been planned meticulously in the days leading up to the announcement. Her private secretary spent the afternoon canceling hundreds of upcoming engagements, while charities and organizations that had enjoyed her patronage received formal notifications that those relationships would be ending immediately. Royal Collections Trust faced the unusual task of cataloging which items in Camilla's possession belonged to the crown and which were personal property. Jewelry, artwork, and ceremonial items that had been loaned for her use as queen consort needed to be returned, while personal gifts and private purchases would remain with her. This process, typically conducted after deaths or divorces, felt surreal when applied to someone simply stepping back from public life. Palace staff found themselves navigating uncharted territory. As they worked to define Camilla's new status within the royal household, she would remain Charles's wife and live at their private residences, but would no longer occupy official royal residences or have access to the full range of royal privileges and protections. Security arrangements needed to be completely reconfigured, with Camilla receiving a level of protection appropriate to her status as the king's private spouse, rather than as queen consort. The Church of England faced its own adjustments. As Camilla's religious role had been an important part of her public duties, the Archbishop of Canterbury issued a statement emphasizing that her spiritual journey would continue privately, while various cathedral chapters began the process of adjusting their ceremonial protocols to reflect the absence of a queen consort at future religious state occasions as evening approached. Camilla began the deeply personal process of packing her belongings for the move to Highgrove, which would become her primary residence going forward. Each item she packed represented a different aspect of her royal life coming to an end. The formal gowns she had worn to state banquets, the hats that had become her signature at public events, the briefing books that had kept her informed about the charities she supported, all were carefully sorted between items to be returned and items to be retained. Her remaining staff gathered in her private sitting room for a final farewell, many of them having served her faithfully throughout the crisis. Despite enormous pressure to abandon their posts, Mrs. Patricia Wells, her dresser for 6 years, spoke for the group when she expressed their continued loyalty and sadness at the way events had unfolded. "You've always been kind to us, ma'am," she said through tears, "and that's what we'll remember." The farewell dinner that evening was a small, private affair attended only by Charles and a few close family members. Princess Anne, despite her role in convincing Charles to act, showed unexpected emotion as she embraced Camilla and whispered words of comfort. The dinner conversation carefully avoided the day's events, focusing instead on memories of happier times and hopes for the future. As night fell over London, the crowds outside the palace began to disperse, but many remained to witness what they understood might be a historic departure. Word had spread through social media that Camilla would be leaving Buckingham Palace that evening for the final time as a member of the working royal family, and thousands wanted to be present for this symbolic moment. The departure itself was carefully choreographed to maintain dignity while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of the circumstances. Camilla emerged from the palace at exactly 9 o'clock. Walking beside Charles to the waiting car that would take her to Highgrove, she wore a simple black coat, having deliberately avoided anything that might appear too formal or ceremonial for the occasion. The crowd's reaction as she appeared was remarkably complex. While many continued to applaud, others fell silent in recognition of the personal sacrifice they were witnessing. Some protesters who had called for her removal found themselves unexpectedly moved by the sight of a woman facing the consequences of her past. Words with apparent grace and acceptance. Camilla paused at the palace doors for one last look at the building that had been her official home, then walked steadily toward the waiting vehicle. Charles accompanied her to the car, their body language suggesting both the strain of the moment and their continued personal bond, despite the public separation of their official roles. As the car pulled away from Buckingham Palace, the crowd erupted in the loudest applause of the entire crisis. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, creating a thunderous ovation that would be remembered as the moment when the British people felt their voices had been truly heard by their constitutional monarchy. The drive-through London to the train station was carefully planned to avoid major thoroughfares where crowds might have gathered. But word of the route spread quickly through social media. Spontaneous gatherings formed at various points along the way, with people lining the streets, not to protest, but to witness history being made at Paddington Station. A small crowd had gathered despite the late hour and the lack of any official announcement about travel plans. The sight of Camilla boarding the train to return to the countryside, where she would begin her new life as a private citizen, marked the end of one of the most extraordinary chapters in modern royal history. The final images broadcast that night showed the train departing London, carrying a woman who had risen to the highest position in British society, only to discover that past attitudes could make that position impossible to maintain. The symbolism was powerful and clear in modern Britain. Even queens must be accountable to the people they claim to serve. As the train disappeared into the darkness, the crowds finally began to disperse, their chants replaced by animated conversations about what they had witnessed and what it might mean for the future of the monarchy. Many participants later described feeling that they had been part of something historically significant, a peaceful demonstration of democratic principles within a constitutional system. The palace doors, which had opened that morning to reveal a king and queen consort addressing their subjects together, closed that night, having witnessed the first voluntary withdrawal of a senior royal family member due to public pressure in modern British history. The thunderous applause that had marked Camilla's departure echoed in the empty courtyard long after the crowds had gone home. A reminder that in the end, the voice of the people had proven stronger than the privileges of position. In the months that followed, historians would debate whether the events of those 9 days represented a crisis overcome or a precedent established. What remained undebated was that Camilla's banishment had demonstrated the monarchy's capacity to adapt when adaptation was necessary for survival, and that the British people, when united in their convictions, possessed the power to hold even their highest institutions accountable to democratic values.